The hill above Sydney. The morning bell of St. Mary's Convent rang across North Sydney's harbour, its bronze voice carrying over red-tiled roofs toward the water's edge. Margaret O'Connor paused in the garden, her hands still dusted with soil from the tomato beds, and watched the ferries carve white lines across the blue. 6 months had passed since she'd taken her vows. Yet each dawn still felt like a small miracle. The stone walls that enclosed their world seemed not like barriers, but like arms protective, purposeful. Here, on this quiet hill, she had found what she'd been searching for. Since leaving her family's farm in Wagga Wagga, Sister Margaret, Rose called from the kitchen doorway, her cheerful voice breaking the morning stillness. "The children will be here soon for lessons." Margaret smiled, brushing dirt from her habit. Rose had that effect on everyone her laughter could brighten. Even Sister Helen's stern expression during evening prayers. At 23, Rose seemed to carry sunshine in her pockets, distributing it freely to the local children, who came for reading lessons, and the elderly who visited for comfort. Inside the convent's main hall, Patricia was already arranging wooden chairs in neat rows. Sharp-minded and methodical, she approached even the simplest tasks with careful precision. Margaret admired how Patricia could balance the monthly accounts in her head, while simultaneously organizing the food pantry donations. "Good morning, Sister Patricia," Margaret said, lifting chairs from a stack near the wall. "Morning," Patricia replied, though her brow was furrowed in concentration. "Have you seen the latest supply invoices? Some of the numbers don't align with what we actually received." Before Margaret could respond, Emily appeared in the doorway, her slight frame almost lost in the black robes. At 19, she was the youngest among them, still adjusting to convent life. Her large brown eyes held a mixture of devotion and uncertainty that reminded Margaret of a sparrow, beautiful but easily startled. "Sister Helen requests your presence in her office." "Sister Margaret," Emily said softly. Margaret found the Mother Superior reviewing correspondence at her wooden desk, the morning light streaming through tall windows behind her. Helen's gray hair was pulled back severely, but her eyes held warmth beneath their stern surface. "Sit, child," Helen said without looking up. "We'll be having a visitor next week. Brother Thomas has been assigned to help us manage our financial affairs. The Archdiocese believes we need guidance in our business matters." Margaret felt a small flutter of unease, though she couldn't name why. "Is something wrong with our accounts, Sister Helen?" "Nothing we've done wrong," Helen replied carefully, finally raising her eyes to meet Margaret's. "But the Church believes our charitable work would benefit from a man's oversight. Brother Thomas comes highly recommended." The bell tower chimed 8 o'clock, and Margaret heard the first sounds of children's voices at the gate. Soon the halls would fill with laughter and the scratch of chalk on slates. She pushed aside her moment of Concerned surely a man devoted to God's work would only strengthen their mission. Standing to leave, Margaret paused at the door. "Sister Helen, will Brother Thomas be staying here permanently?" Helen's pen hesitated above the paper. "For as long as necessary, child. For as long as necessary." Outside, the Sydney morning continued its gentle awakening. Ferry horns calling across the harbour. Seabirds wheeling above the stone walls of St. Mary's. Margaret returned to her garden, unaware that this peaceful morning filled with soil-stained fingers, children's laughter, and the protective embrace of familiar walls would soon become a memory she'd carry like a pressed flower. Fragile and precious, for the rest of her life. The shadow had not yet fallen, but already the light seemed somehow different. The shadow of money. Brother Thomas arrived on a Tuesday, his black sedan gleaming against the convent's weathered stones. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. His smile was practiced, his handshake firm as he greeted Sister Helen in the courtyard. "Such devoted women," he proclaimed to the small gathering of nuns. "God has blessed this place with true servants of His will." Margaret noticed how his eyes lingered on each of them, calculating, assessing. When his gaze reached Emily, the youngest sister stepped backward, her hands twisting nervously in her robes. Within days, Thomas had established himself in the convent's administrative office, spreading ledgers and invoices across Sister Helen's former desk. He spoke frequently of efficiency and proper stewardship, his voice carrying through the stone corridors with increasing authority. "Sisters," he announced during evening prayers, "we must modernize our charitable operations. The Church expects accountability, and I intend to provide it." The first sign of trouble came when Mrs. Henderson from the local parish arrived with her monthly donation, £50 she'd saved from her pension for the children's reading program. "I'm sorry," Thomas told her at the front door, his tone polite but dismissive. "We can no longer accept such irregular contributions. All donations must now go through proper diocesan channels." Margaret watched from the garden as Mrs. Henderson walked away, confusion etched in her elderly features. For 3 years, the woman had faithfully supported their work with local children. Now her money was being turned away. Why would he refuse her donation? Margaret asked Patricia later that evening. Patricia's sharp eyes darted toward the administrative office before she whispered, "The invoices don't match what we've received. Food deliveries are being billed at twice what actually arrives. And that money Mrs. Henderson offered? I saw Thomas pocket it after she left." The atmosphere in St. Mary's began to shift like weather before a storm. Conversations dropped to whispers when Thomas approached. The children's laughter seemed more subdued during lessons, as if the building itself had grown watchful and tense. Emily bore the worst of it. Thomas would call her to his office for consultations, emerging with tear-stained cheeks and papers clutched in her trembling hands. "Just signatures," she whispered to Margaret one afternoon. "He says they're routine administrative documents, but I don't understand what they mean." When Rose questioned a missing food delivery during dinner, Thomas's response was swift and humiliating. "Sister Rose," he said loudly enough for all to hear, "perhaps you should concern yourself with prayer rather than matters beyond your comprehension." Pride is a sin, especially in women who have taken vows of obedience. Rose's cheerful spirit dimmed after that public rebuke. The laughter that once filled the kitchen fell silent. Margaret lay awake at night, listening to the harbor sounds beyond the walls. The convent that had felt like sanctuary now pressed around her like a trap. Thomas wore the cloth of holy service, spoke the language of divine purpose, yet everything he touched seemed to wither. During morning prayers, she watched him bow his head with theatrical piety while his hands counted money from the collection plate. The same hands that blessed their meals were stealing from widows and orphans. "How can we oppose him?" Helen confided to Margaret one evening, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "The Archdiocese sent him. To question Brother Thomas is to question the Church itself." But Margaret knew what she had witnessed. The forged invoices Patricia had discovered. The donations that disappeared. Emily's frightened tears after each consultation. Rose's broken spirit. The children who no longer received the books and supplies their families had paid for. God's work was being corrupted by a man who wrapped theft in the language of righteousness. And the very institution they had trusted to protect them had become the weapon of their oppression. As autumn rain began to fall on the convent walls, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Justice, she realized, sometimes required disobedience. Faith, true faith, demanded courage to confront evil even when it wore the mask of holy authority. The shadow had fallen completely now, but in the darkness, Margaret began to plan. Doors closed. The Archbishop's palace in Sydney rose before Margaret like a fortress of faith, its Gothic spires piercing the October sky. She had travelled here carrying Patricia's carefully documented evidence, forged invoices, missing donation records, testimonies written in Emily's shaking hand. Surely, she thought, climbing the stone steps, the Church would act when presented with proof of Brother Thomas's corruption. Monsignor Burns received her in his oak-panelled office, his red-rimmed eyes studying her over wire spectacles. Behind him hung portraits of previous archbishops, their painted gazes stern and unforgiving. "Sister Margaret," he began before she could speak, "Brother Thomas has already informed us of your concerns. He speaks of a troubled young woman, prone to fantasy and disobedience." Margaret's heart sank, but she pressed forward. "Monsignor, I have documentation. Financial records that prove." "That prove what?" Burns interrupted, his voice sharp as winter wind. "That you question the authority God has placed over you? That you spread malicious rumors about a devoted servant of the church?" She laid Patricia's notebook on his desk, pages filled with meticulous calculations and discrepancies. Burns barely glanced at them. "Brother Thomas explained these irregularities," he said, pushing the notebook back toward her. "Temporary accounting adjustments, perfectly legitimate. Your accusations, however, are not. But the missing donations, Mrs. Henderson's money. Enough." Burns stood, his cassock rustling with indignation. "You will return to St. Mary's immediately. You will confess your sin of disobedience to Brother Thomas and beg his forgiveness. Any further insubordination will result in your immediate expulsion from religious life." Margaret walked back through Sydney's streets in a daze, the notebook clutched against her chest like armor that had failed to protect her. The very institution she had trusted with her soul had chosen to believe lies over truth, to protect power over innocence. At St. Mary's, news of her failed appeal had already arrived. Thomas waited in the courtyard, his smile triumphant. "Sister Margaret," he announced loudly enough for all to hear, "I'm told you've been spreading falsehoods about our work here." Such behavior is unbecoming of a bride of Christ. The other nuns avoided her eyes. Even Helen, once her mentor, looked away in apparent shame. Only Patricia dared meet her gaze, and Margaret saw in her friend's expression the same dawning realization they were alone. That night, Margaret lay sleepless in her narrow bed, listening to Emily's muffled sobs from the next cell. Through her small window, Sydney's lights twinkled like distant stars, a world away from their stone prison. Rose appeared at her doorway like a ghost, her once bright face hollow with fear. "He knows we talked," Rose whispered. "Thomas knows we've been sharing information. He's watching us all now." "What did he do?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He's reassigned me to night kitchen duty. Alone. He says it's penance for my gossiping tongue." Rosa's voice broke. "Margaret, I'm afraid. The way he looks at us. It's not holy. It's hungry." The next morning brought worse news. Emily stumbled into the chapel during prayers, her face pale as communion wafer. In her trembling hands were legal documents bearing her signature. "He made me sign papers," she whispered to Margaret afterward. "Transfer forms for the convent's property. He said it was routine, that I was helping God's work, but..." She began to cry. "I think I've signed away our home." Margaret felt the last of her faith in church authority crumble like ancient stone. The men in their grand offices, the hierarchy she had revered, the system she had trusted, all of it was complicit in Thomas's corruption. They would not save them. They would not even listen. That evening, she gathered her sisters in the small chapel after night prayers. Patricia came first, then Rose, finally Emily, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. "We have two choices," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can stay and watch Thomas destroy everything we've built, exploit everyone who trusted us, and break us one by one. Or we can leave." "Leave?" Emily's voice was tiny as a child's. "But we're nuns. We took vows. We took vows to serve God," Margaret replied, "not to enable theft and abuse. If staying means betraying everything we believe in, then leaving becomes an act of faith." Helen appeared in the doorway, her aged face etched with sorrow. "I heard voices," she said softly, then looked at each of them in turn. "What are you planning?" Margaret met her mentor's eyes. "To escape. To find somewhere we can serve God truly, without corruption, without fear." Helen closed her eyes, decades of loyalty warring with the evidence of her own senses. When she opened them again, Margaret saw her decision. "Then we go together," Helen said. "If we stay, we lose ourselves. If we leave, at least we have a chance to remain who God called us to be." Outside the chapel windows, Sydney slept, unaware that 5 women of faith were planning an act that would challenge everything. They had been taught about obedience, authority, and the price of truth. The doors of earthly power had closed against them. But somewhere beyond the convent walls, other doors might still open. The escape. The morning after their chapel meeting, Margaret slipped away during prayer time, her heart hammering against her ribs as she walked through Sydney's bustling streets. She had never ventured so far from the convent alone, and the city's noise felt overwhelming after months of whispered conversations and muffled footsteps. Paddington Market sprawled before her in organized chaos, vendors calling their wares, children darting between stalls. The mingled scents of fresh bread and ripe fruit filling the air. Margaret approached the produce section hesitantly, unsure how to begin such an impossible conversation. Mr. Miller stood behind his fruit stall, weathered hands arranging oranges with practiced care. His kind eyes noticed her distress immediately. The way she lingered, started to speak, then stopped, wringing her hands beneath her black sleeves. "You look troubled, sister," he said gently, his voice carrying the soft accent of rural New South Wales. "Something I can help with?" Margaret glanced around nervously, then leaned closer to his stall. We need help. Assistance of a kind I shouldn't be asking for." Miller's expression grew serious. He studied her face, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. After a long moment, he nodded toward the back of his stall. "Come, we'll talk privately." Behind stacked crates of apples, Margaret found herself pouring out their story: Thomas's corruption, the church's betrayal, their growing desperation. Miller listened without interruption, his calloused hands still as stones. My daughter Sarah was 15 when the parish priest took an interest in her, he said finally, his voice heavy with old pain. Claimed he was preparing her for a special calling. Took me 3 years to understand what that calling really was. He looked directly at Margaret. I know what it means to be trapped by those who wear God's cloth but serve the devil's purpose. We need to leave, Margaret whispered. All of us. But the convent is watched, and we have nowhere to go. Miller was quiet for several minutes, studying the late afternoon crowds. Then he smiled, not with joy, but with grim determination. The back wall of your convent faces Miller Street. There's a section where the mortar's crumbling. I noticed it delivering vegetables last month. Give me 2 days to prepare. 3 nights later, storm clouds gathered over Sydney Harbour like dark conspirators. Margaret lay in her narrow bed, listening to rain begin its assault on the convent's ancient stones. At 11:30, she rose silently and made her way through corridors she had walked for 18 months. Seeing them now as if for the first time and the last. In the small storage room behind the kitchen, 5 women gathered like shadows. Miller had left a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, simple dresses, woolen coats, sturdy shoes, civilian clothes that would transform them from nuns into anonymous women. Are we certain? Helen whispered, her aged hands trembling as she fingered the foreign fabric. I'm certain we cannot stay, Margaret replied. She began unfastening her habit, the black wool that had defined her identity falling away like shed skin. Emily wept silently as she changed, but her movements were resolute. Rose's usual brightness was subdued but determined. Patricia moved with characteristic efficiency, folding her habit with the same care she brought to the account books Thomas had corrupted. The midnight bell tolled through the storm as Margaret opened the back door. Rain struck her uncovered face, the first time in years she had felt weather directly on her skin. The sensation was shocking, almost violent in its immediacy. They moved across the garden in single file, their civilian shoes slipping on wet stone paths. At the back wall, Margaret found Miller's rope ladder exactly where promised, secured to iron stakes driven between loose stones. I'll go first, she whispered, though her hands shook as she grasped the rough rope. The wall loomed above them, 8 feet of mortared stone that had protected them and now imprisoned them. Climbing was harder than she had imagined. The rope bit into her palms. Rain made every grip treacherous, and her legs, weakened by months of limited movement, trembled with effort. But with each pull upward, she felt something loosening in her chest, as if invisible chains were breaking link by link. At the wall's top, she paused to look back. The convent lay beneath her like a ship run aground, its familiar windows glowing with lamplight, its bells silent now, except for the wind's low moaning through the tower. Everything she had known, everything she had believed about her place in God's plan, remained behind those walls. Then she swung her legs over and dropped into the alley beyond. Emily came next, her thin frame making the climb look deceptively easy until she reached the top and froze. Paralyzed by the height and the finality of the moment. "Come on," Margaret urged from below. "I'll catch you." Emily closed her eyes and let herself fall, trusting Margaret to break her descent. They tumbled together into the muddy alley, both gasping with relief and terror. Rose followed more surely, her natural grace serving her well. Patricia descended with methodical precision, pausing at each rung to ensure secure footing. Helen took the longest. At 68, her joints protested every movement, and twice she nearly fell backward. But something in her weathered face, perhaps the memory of younger days when she had possessed similar courage, drove her upward and over. They stood together in the narrow alley, rain streaming down their faces, civilian clothes clinging to their bodies. For the first time in months, no bells marked the hour. No rules governed their movements. No watchful eyes monitored their behavior. "We did it," Rose whispered, and for a moment her old brightness flickered through. Margaret looked at each of her sisters, no longer sisters in the religious sense, but bound now by something deeper than vows. They were 5 women who had chosen conscience over comfort, truth over security, freedom over the false peace of submission. "We are no longer nuns," she said quietly, her words nearly lost in the storm. "We are women who have found our voices. And we will use them." Thunder rolled across Sydney Harbour as they walked into the darkness, leaving behind the stone walls that had sheltered and suffocated them. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the vast complexity of a world they would have to navigate without the protection of religious authority. But they walked forward together, their footsteps echoing in empty streets, their heads uncovered beneath the weeping sky, finally and completely free. Voices after silence. The 5 women scattered like seeds on wind, each finding refuge in different corners of New South Wales. Margaret became Mary O'Brien in Bathurst, working as a seamstress in a small shop where her steady hands and quiet demeanour drew no unwanted attention. Helen reinvented herself as Ellen Hayes in Newcastle, teaching children their letters in exchange for modest wages and a room above the bakery. For 25 years, they lived as ghosts of their former selves, connected only by occasional letters written in careful code. Rose found work cleaning offices in Wollongong, her cheerful nature gradually returning as months passed without fear. Patricia secured a position keeping books for a hardware store in Orange, her sharp mind invaluable to the owner, who never questioned her lack of formal references. Emily, the youngest and most fragile, settled in a boarding house in Dubbo, mending clothes and tending a small garden that reminded her of the convent's peaceful mornings. They aged quietly, anonymously, their past buried beneath layers of assumed identities and careful silences. Margaret's hair turned silver. Her hands grew arthritic, but her eyes retained the fierce clarity that had driven her over the convent wall that stormy night. One by one, death claimed them. Rose passed first, suddenly and peacefully in her sleep at 67. Helen followed 3 years later, her heart finally surrendering after decades of carrying unspoken burdens. Emily lived until 71, her gentle spirit flickering out like a candle in a gentle breeze. Patricia lasted the longest after Margaret, her methodical nature extending even to dying. She summoned Margaret to her bedside in Orange's small hospital, her once sharp features softened by illness but her mind still crystal clear. "I kept records," Patricia whispered, pressing a leather-bound notebook into Margaret's weathered hands. "Everything. Thomas's forged invoices, the missing donations, Emily's testimony about those papers she signed. All of it." Margaret opened the notebook, seeing pages filled with Patricia's meticulous handwriting, dates, amounts, documented conversations. Evidence of corruption preserved across 24 years of hiding. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why keep this when we agreed to forget?" Patricia's eyes blazed with their old intensity. "Because forgetting serves them, not us. Promise me, Margaret, when the time comes, when you're the last one left, tell the truth. Don't let silence win." 6 months later, Margaret stood alone at Patricia's graveside, the notebook heavy in her coat pocket. At 70 years old, she was the sole survivor of their desperate escape. The only witness left to testify to what had driven 5 faithful women to abandon everything they had believed sacred. The decision came on a gray morning in autumn 2008, 25 years after their flight. Margaret boarded a train in Bathurst, her arthritic hands gripping Patricia's notebook, and travelled back to Sydney for the first time since that stormy night. The city had grown beyond recognition. Glass towers reached toward heaven where once modest buildings had squatted. Traffic flowed in rivers of steel and noise. But when the taxi deposited her on the hill above North Sydney, Margaret felt time collapse like folded paper. Street, Mary's convent was gone. In its place stood a modern community centre, all clean lines and large windows. A brass plaque near the entrance read, "Street, Mary's Community Centre, serving North Sydney since 1995. Margaret walked slowly around the building's perimeter, finding the spot where the back wall had once stood. A children's playground occupied the space now, filled with laughter and the sound of small feet running on safe rubber surfaces. The alley where they had dropped to freedom was a garden path lined with rosebushes. An elderly woman approached, noticing Margaret's intent examination of the grounds. "Did you know the old convent?" she asked kindly. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "My grandmother used to bring me here for reading lessons when I was small. The nuns were lovely women, especially Sister Rose. She always had sweets in her pockets. The woman smiled. They disappeared quite suddenly one night, all of them. No one ever knew why. That evening, in her hotel room overlooking Sydney Harbour, Margaret opened Patricia's notebook one final time. The meticulous records told a story of systematic corruption, abuse of power, and institutional betrayal. But they also told another story of 5 women who had found the courage to choose conscience over comfort, truth over security. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Sydney Morning Herald. "I have a story to tell," she said when the reporter answered. "About faith and corruption, about silence and voice. About what it means to serve God truly when the Church itself becomes the enemy of justice." The next morning, Margaret sat in the newspaper's offices. Patricia's evidence spread across the conference table like pieces of a long-buried puzzle. For the first time in 25 years, she spoke her real name aloud, reclaimed her true history, and broke the silence that had protected the guilty while erasing the innocent. "Faith," she told the reporter, her voice steady despite her tears, "is not blind obedience to authority. True faith requires the courage to confront injustice, even when it wears holy robes. Silence protects the oppressor. Only voice can free the oppressed." Outside the newspaper building, Sydney Harbour sparkled in morning sunlight. And somewhere in the city's busy streets, the truth began its long journey toward the light.
The end. Thanks. Your like and subscription mean more than you know. They help me keep creating and sharing heartfelt stories